So I used to have this picture, and it was a very eloquent, nice framed picture of an engineer, an airman engineer, up on top of a roof building out this framed wooden structure. It's very picturesque. He's got the sun is setting behind him, and he's kind of silhouetted against it. My daughter comes up to me one day, and as daughters are able to do, they challenge basically everything you hold dear and what you believe, right, with just a simple question. And the line of questioning goes something like this: "Hey, Daddy, who's that?" Like, "Oh, this is an airman. He's an engineer. He's doing airman engineer stuff." "Cool. What's he doing?" Like, "Well, he's hammering the roof deck on. He's making this structure so that somebody can live in it. He's deployed somewhere, supporting whatever we need him to support." "Well, that's cool. So why is he doing that?" Like, "Well, that's kind of a weird question, honey. Like, you need roofs on buildings, right, or else people get wet." And then she says this one, right? She says, No. I mean, why is it him? Why does the Air Force need him doing it?" And I thought about that one, and I just sent her away because I couldn't really answer it, right? And so specifically, and maybe she was getting at this, or maybe she wasn't. Why do we need that airman doing it? Why don't we contract it all out? Why don't we get the Army to do it? Right? Why don't we just get unskilled labor? Why do I specifically need that engineer swinging that hammer at that structure on that day? And I think that we're not able to explain that. And so, to borrow a page from Simon Sinek, where we can always explain generally what we do. We can explain how we do it. But we're very, very light on why we do it. And so when I go back to when I first came into the Air Force and I sat in this room and the whole CE organization and what the Air Force did was explained to me, the why was missing. It's very easy to get lost in the sauce when we start talking about, wait, firefighters are part of CE? I didn't learn that in college, right? Pest management, prime beef, red horse, what are you talking about? What I'll tell you is that is the key to understanding and to be able to communicate our relevance. And so when we look through, what I believe is that history gives us that glimpse into why we do what we do. And specifically today, what I want to talk to you about is, why do we exist? Why does CE exist? And then the second part is, why do we look the way we look? Because both of those two answers are fundamental to understanding who we are and where we come from. And what I'll tell you is, even though he wasn't an engineer, I believe General Arnold understood that. I believe he got it. I believe he understood why the Air Force has its own and needs its own engineers. And so when General Arnold said, "Air bases are a determining factor in the success of air operations. The two-legged stool of men and planes would topple over without this equally important third leg." And we've used that in our doctrine in the past to say this is where we derive our purpose from. But we have also forgotten about that third leg, or we undervalue that third leg, right? That the way that the Air Force fights is different than the other services. I fight from my base, I use it to project combat power, unlike the Army, who fights from the battlefields, and the Navy, who fights from their ships. The Air Force fights from our installations. And so I need people that can maintain and operate and fight those bases like a weapon system. And so it is from that quote from General Arnold that we derive our purpose, right? It's in our doctrine that our purpose is to support the projection of air power. And the reason why that's important is because that doesn't change through history. What we do, how we do those things, they change. They have changed over time, and you'll see that today. But the why we exist and why the Air Force needs its own engineers has not. Going all the way back to World War II, the reasons why we had them in World War II, the same that we have them today. And so our story is going to start in World War II. So understanding why engineers are so important to the way that the Air Force fights and the contribution of air bases to the way the Air Force fights, General Arnold, very early at the beginning of World War II, he creates aviation engineer battalions. He pulls them out of the Corps of Engineers and activates them in 1940. The intent of these was to be dedicated support to the Army Air Forces, right? It wasn't to be combat engineers when they had the time or doing something else. It was dedicated support to the Air Forces, right? And so their mission was to construct, conceal, maintain, and when necessary, defend airfields. They were experts at doing airfields. That was their job, that was their specialty, and that was their only mission. And so we had about 120,000 engineers or so in World War II scattered across 2 theaters all over the world. And one of the things that they were able to do because of this decision by General Arnold to make specialists in building airfields, is at their peak, they were able to put an airfield into service like every 36 hours, right? So quite impressive and quite a lot that was accomplished because of the way that we organized them, because of the emphasis that General Arnold put on having our own engineers. And so I'll read this quote to you as well from General Spaatz. So General Spaatz was the commander of strategic air forces in Europe, and then later after VE Day, the commander of strategic air forces in the Pacific. And he said this, he said, "The aviation engineers have become as nearly indispensable to the Army Air Forces as is possible to ascribe to any single branch thereof," right? So you have very, very high praise from a very, very high level on what the aviation engineers were able to accomplish in World War II. And so after World War II, they get together, this board of officers comes together at Maxwell. And it was engineers from the different theaters, right? So North Africa, Europe, Pacific. The way we organized ourselves and employed engineers was a little different in every theater. And so they bring this together, this report of folks at Maxwell, and they say the idea is it's a hot wash, right? What worked good or what did not work well. And so one of the things that the central idea that comes out of this board of officers is they said something kind of like this: centralization of command under one engineer command was the only method of control that enabled us to construct airfields and to be able to respond to the requirements of the overall Air Force commander. Now, the command they're talking about was 9th Engineer Command. And that was the way we organized prior to the invasion in Normandy. And so that was the organization structure we used in Europe. 9th Engineer Command, commanded by, at the time, Brigadier General James Newman, will later go on to be Major General. But General Newman commanded 9th Engineer Command, and the idea is that he had visibility into all the engineer efforts that were going on in Europe, and so he was able to orchestrate, and he knew what the battle plans were and what the Air Force was trying to do, and so he was able to move and engineers where they needed to be able to achieve these effects and to accomplish the overall mission. And so that was the central lesson learned that came out of this board of reports. This is in 1946. This idea that it's a lesson that we learned, right, in quotation marks. And I have the quotation marks because you'll see it come up again. But this idea that the Air Force needs its own engineers, right? So that's what General Arnold did in 1940. We had aviation engineers dedicated to the Air Force. I need my own engineers, and they need to be led by an airman that understands how air power works, understands air power effects, and can respond to the needs of the overall Air Force commander. After World War II, coming out of World War II, we understood the value in the Air Force having its own engineers, right? But in 1947, one of the things that the National Security Act did, in addition to establishing the Air Force as a separate service, is it also split out what the construction requirements and the engineer requirements were going to be, or responsibilities were going to be, between the Army and the Air Force. And so the way it split it out was the Army kept all permanent responsibility for all permanent construction in the CONUS and the OCONUS. They kept all contingency capabilities, all contracting capabilities within the Corps of Engineers, and they retained all of the aviation engineers to be able to do that. And so what the Air Force was left with was no contingency capability at all. The only engineers that the Air Force was allowed to maintain and keep was just those organic to Air Force wings that we needed to be able to operate and maintain our bases. And that was it. And so, but again, no contingency capabilities for the Air Force. And so there's a gentleman by the name of Brigadier General Orrin Price, who was a veteran, as many of them were then, a veteran of World War II. He served in 9th Engineer Command. And at the time, he said what I'm about to tell you is he was serving at the half. And I give you this quote because that delineation of responsibilities was not mutually agreed on. The Air Force didn't agree with it, and General Price said there was a lot of concern. This is only 2 years after World War II. There's a lot of concern that they were already losing a warfighting capability that we had in World War II. They were under a lot of pressure to civilianize out everything, to contract out a lot of things, and they very early on, Air Force Civil Engineering is having to fight for, no, I need my own engineers. We've just learned this lesson. I'm still having to fight for that already. And so at the base level, what a base level squadron looked like at that time, we called it the installation engineer, not civil engineering. But what a base level squadron looked like was not unlike what you might see today. Maybe 300 people, 4 or 5 officers, 100 enlisted, and then like 100 to 200 civilians, right? Kind of the same-ish as you see today. And the responsibilities were the same too, right? So responsibilities for things like real estate actions, facility rehabilitation and alteration, operating, maintaining buildings, siting new construction and managing it and figuring out what the new construction needed to be, realizing that it was going to be the Army that actually did it, okay? And then fire protection. And so fire protection and structural firefighting were part of the installation engineer's duties. And they were part of, the interesting thing here is that they were actually part of the post engineer's duties before the Air Force existed. So what I tell the firefighters is that firefighters have been part of CE since before CE was a thing, right? Because in 1944, the Army added firefighting to the post engineer's duties. And then in 1947, we kept it. Why did we keep it? Because we realized that we charged the base engineer with things like making sure that we're with fire prevention plans, with fire suppression systems, that they're technically accurate, that we manage all these things. They're so tied into real property and real estate actions. We wanted one person in charge of all those things. So much so that when fire protection and aircraft rescue merged in 1948, we still kept it with the base civil engineer. Okay, and it's that kind of regulation in that time frame where we got the idea that the post engineer is the base fire marshal. That's where it comes from, is the 1944 regulation in the Army. On the contingency side, on the troop construction side, the way the Army did it, so the Army realized or knew that they were charged with supporting the Air Force, right, with all this, with construction and contingency capability. And so the Army establishes this program called SCARWAF, Special Category Army Personnel with Air Force, SCARWAF, SCARWAF. And the idea is that the Army would recruit the troops for it, they would organize, train, and equip, and then they would provide these units to the Air Force that the Air Force would then command and control, and the Air Force would use them however they needed to do, right? By 1950, that already was not working. The Air Force had to assume responsibility for equipping them, because if you're in the Army, and you know that you have to give up some of your troops and some of your equipment to the Air Force, what are you going to do? I'm not going to give them my best stuff, right? I'm going to give them my broke junk, and I'm going to give them my troops that maybe aren't the sharpest ones, right? And that's exactly what happened. And so the Air Force had to take over equipping the units, and by 1950 realized it's not working, and so they tried to get the Secretary of Defense to transfer the SCARWAF units over into the Air Force, and the Secretary of Defense said no. So despite this idea that we already knew in World War II that we need our own engineers, we had this split kind of responsibility thing in 1950, and that's the arrangement that we went into Korea with. So when we entered Korea, what we ended up with, we had 2 SCARWAF aviation groups that were assigned to Far East Air Forces. Those two groups were approximately 65% manned. And in the assessment of the commanders of those groups, they were only 10 to maybe 15% as efficient as we were in World War II. There were a couple of reasons for that. One is they were using old equipment. The construction equipment they were using at the time had not kept up and had not modernized. So they're still using old World War II equipment, materials, patching materials and things like that. And so the other reason why is they're somewhat victims of technology, right? Like technology didn't stop. So the other thing that's going on in the Air Force is that we had jet engines now in Korea. We had larger aircraft, they need larger facilities, they need stronger runways, longer runways. One of the reasons why in World War II, the aviation engineers were able to put an airfield into service every 36 hours is because they were dirt strips, right? I can't do that anymore in Korea, but the equipment hasn't kept up with the times, right? So we needed more specialized equipment and didn't have it, and also didn't have the best trained troops either. And so all those things kind of come together and they culminate and you get things like this, okay? Now what this is, and I show you this because I want this picture to be burned in your memory. Every engineer needs to have this photo burned in his or her memory. This is a picture of an F-51 Mustang in Korea taxiing through a puddle of water. And this is exactly why we exist. And when you talk to the operators and you talk to whoever else it is about why you do what you do, it's to prevent this. And the failure in Korea was the failure to organize, train, and equip our engineers to be able to deal and do the mission, and you got mission stoppage or mission impact because of engineers, which is a giant failure, right? So much so that the official Air Force history books say this: in 2 years of war in Korea, no single factor had so seriously handicapped 5th Air Force operational capabilities as the lack of adequate air facilities. That's really startling, because what it doesn't say is that the weather, the North Koreans, the MiGs we were fighting, none of those things had more impact on limiting Air Force capabilities as lack of adequate air facilities, which is 100% an indictment on the way that we chose to organize engineers in that war. And so this is, remembered, this is like 1953 or so. This is less than 10 years after General Spatz's quote about saying the aviation engineers are as indispensable as any other branch of the service. This is also still an example of that, right? It's a negative example of that. You had positive examples in World War II about all the things we were able to accomplish. You had negative examples in Korea about all the things we were not able to accomplish. But either way, it shows this is how important the engineers are to the way the Air Force fights. And so the lessons, again, learned that come out of Korea is very much the same idea that we had in World War II. The idea that the Air Force needs its own engineers. I need my own engineers. They need to be led by an airman then they need to be specialists in the art of building airfields, not just engineers that are combat engineers or whatever that are moved off when they have the time or when it comes up in the priority list, right? I need my own engineers that understand aviation. So after Korea, everybody realizes that this SCAR-WOF arrangement is not working. The Air Force tries again to lobby the SecDef to transfer all the aviation engineers back to the Air Force. And the SecDef again says no. But the SecDef does abolish the SCAR-WOF program, but basically says the Army still has responsibility to support the Air Force. This time they're just going to do a better job. Okay? And so basically in 1955, we're back to the same place we were 10 years ago. We haven't really accomplished anything. We're back to the Air Force is completely reliant on the Army for its contingency capability. So the Air Force in the 50s is focusing on, the installation engineers at the bases are focusing on building up the permanent bases. At this time in 1956, we have about 50,000 engineers in CE, 30,000 military, about 20,000 civilians. We start focusing on building up the main bases. In addition to focusing on building up the main bases, the installation engineers, as part of that, start turning their attention to base recovery, because what they realized is that if I'm responsible for operating this airfield and keeping this airfield operational, I need an ability to be able to restore combat operations after the enemy attacks it. And so in 1956, the Air Force charges the installation engineer with base recovery functions, things including, amongst other things, firefighting, demolition, and area decontamination. What we collectively understand now and use the term BRAT, right? Base recovery after attack. This is where BRAT comes from. But what's interesting is that at this time, the base engineer has the firefighters, but he doesn't have the EOD and the disaster prep or emergency management folks, right? So while the Air Force gave the installation engineer the responsibility for it, didn't necessarily give him or her the whole personnel to be able to do it. But this is the beginning of an argument that finally starts to kind of resonate with DoD, that the Air Force needs its own capability, engineer capability. And so in 1957, the DoD says, okay, fine. The Army's still going to do troop construction for the Air Force, but within your organic capability, Air Force, you can develop this capability to be able to do emergency repairs to recover bomb-damaged air bases. So in the late 50s and early 60s, we surged our engineer force from, I said in 1956 we had about 50,000 engineers. By 1960 we had about 100,000 engineers. Okay, 60,000 of which were civilians. And so we surged to be able to do this massive construction program for the permanent bases. And so, but still, this contingency response part was largely a pickup game. In the late 50s and early 60s, there are 3 international crises that kick off. One being a crisis in Lebanon where we had to bed down 5,000 Marines at Incirlik Air Base, and the Army couldn't move fast enough to be able to do it. The other one being the buildup of U.S. forces in Europe in response to the building of the Berlin Wall. and then the other one being the movement of forces within the CONUS in response to the Cuban Missile Crisis. In all three of those cases, the Army is, again, they're supposed to give us contingency response, but they're not able to move fast enough. And so the Air Force does it. USAFE experiments with this concept called the Civil Engineer Mobile Team concept, which is basically what you would think of when you thought of prime beef today. They carved out groups of military engineers within their existing units that were able to deploy somewhat at a moment's notice to be able to accomplish these things. And they had limited success with it. But the escalation of the war in Vietnam highlighted that we're not going to be able to deal with just ad hoc arrangements anymore. We have to formalize this capability because it's getting too much for us to bear by just gentleman's agreement and coming up with a different process every single time we do this. Okay, so about the time that the war in Vietnam is escalating, this other thing happens. We get another opportunity because Congress asks the Air Force, hey, why don't you civilianize all of your peacetime engineer functions? And so, because I told you before, we had about 60,000 civilians by this time, 40,000 military, and the idea was, the idea from the Congress was, why don't you civilianize a lot of those? And so Major General Robert Curtin is the Director of Civil Engineering at the time, and so he takes the opportunity and he forms what we called the Civil Engineering Manpower Study Group. It started in 1963, and to look at both of these issues, right? It was led by, he appoints at the time Colonel Tom Meredith, who would later go on to be Brigadier General Meredith. He appoints Colonel Meredith to run this study group. And the idea was look at both issues at the same time, right? One, I'd have no formal rapid mobility response capability for contingencies and emergencies. That's issue one. The issue two is that as we've developed and we've grown as a service, there's no consistency in the way we have our civilians and military split up. There's no consistency among bases, among commands, and so it's basically been county option everywhere you go, right? No rhyme or reason to why I have this many or that many or whatever, right? Fighter bases weren't the same, PACAF bases weren't the same. And so the idea of this group was look at both of those issues at the same time and figure out what you can figure out. The result that came out of that was Prime Beef, right? The Prime Base Engineer Emergency Force. It was named by Brigadier General Price that I talked to you about earlier in World War II. He was up at the HAF at this time. He came up with the name. And it was approved by Congress in 1964 as the answer to both of those questions, right? It was a simple construct, a novel construct that nobody else uses in the service, right? This idea that I'm going to use my military engineers to do both jobs, right? I'm going to do my peacetime mission, and they're going to deploy, those peacetime engineers are going to deploy in support of contingencies and emergencies. And the civilians are part of the program too. The civilian engineers on the garrison are going to be there for their expertise, for their continuity, to be able to train the military when they're there, and then when they're not, to be able to keep the lights on in the garrison when they're gone. And so how many engineers, civilian and military, do I need to be able to do that? And that is the Prime Beef program, and that's what came out and was approved by Congress in 1964. And so the first units for Prime Beef actually deployed out into South Vietnam in the summer of 1965. All right, so about this time that Prime Beef arrives into Vietnam, we get this letter from the Secretary of Defense. In May of 1965, Secretary of Defense sends the Secretary of the Air Force a letter, and it says, I understand the Marines will move from a Viet Cong-controlled, undeveloped land area at Chow Lay to a 4-squadron operational field in 28 days, during which they will construct an 8,000-foot runway. Does the Air Force have the similar capability? And if not, what can be done to develop it? The answer obviously is no, right? Because we have no organic troop construction capability. We're completely dependent on the Army to do that. But so General Curtin, at the same time, he's under pressure from the Chief of Staff at the time was General LeMay. And General LeMay wanted 2 or 3 more air bases built in South Vietnam. And so General Curtin's under pressure to be able to do that. And we've got this letter from the SecDef that seems to allow and open this door for a capacity to be able to develop our own capability for troop construction. Because what General Curtin does is first he goes and he asks the Army and the Navy. He asked the Army and the Navy, can you do this? And the answer from the Army was no. One of the reasons why the answer from the Army was no is because by this time the Army had decided to push a lot of its heavy engineer capability into the Guard and Reserve. So they had made conscious decisions to reduce their active duty in strength, and they pushed their capability into the Guard and Reserve. The other downfall in that is that there was a national policy decision not to activate the Guard and the Reserve in Vietnam. So the Army had almost no capability at all. And they had to struggle to get their own active duty construction battalions. By the time the construction battalions got into Vietnam, they were inundated with Army requirements, and the Army said, I can't help you, Air Force, you're on your own. And so General Curtin says this: we have no choice. We've got to do this, and the only way we can do it is heavy maintenance. And if we have to do some construction with heavy maintenance, we'll just have to let the definitions stand by themselves. And so this idea from General Curtin is that I've got this prime beef construct, we'll just call it heavy maintenance, because I'm still hamstrung by this idea that I don't do troop construction. We'll just call it heavy maintenance, and then whatever falls out of that, the definitions are just going to have to be what the definitions are going to be, right? And so he commissions another study, this time in 1965, again headed by Brigadier General Meredith, called Prime Beef Heavy Repair Squadrons. And the idea was that there's two objectives of the study, primarily two objectives of the study, was to develop a capability, an organic rapid response capability that could augment base engineers and do more than what they were capable of doing. The other objective is to accomplish major repairs where contracts are not available, something that could go in and do that. And then this tertiary objective that just says, as a byproduct, we may accidentally build some things, right? If some of that kind of falls out after of our heavy maintenance efforts, then maybe we'll get some airfield and cantonment facility construction, right? And so this is approved by Congress in 1965, and it is at the time called, we activated in October of 1965 the first two civil engineering squadrons, parentheses, heavy repair, okay? So it was a heavy repair capability. It ultimately became known as Red Horse. Okay, what we know now today is Red Horse, Rapid Engineer Deployable Heavy Operational Repair Squadron Engineer. Okay, Red Horse. Now General Meredith, the way he tells the story, he came up with the name. And he came up with the name because red's his favorite color and a horse is faster than a bull. And then he said it took him 2 days to come up with the acronym to make it all fit, right? So Red Horse is activated, it's approved by Congress, and the first Red Horse units roll into Vietnam in February of 1966. So in Vietnam, we see the first deployment of both Prime Beef and Red Horse in Vietnam. And the other thing that's interesting that happens in Vietnam is Brigadier General Archie Mays gets sent this letter by PACAF to go be essentially the 7th Air Force engineer. And then the letter that he gets, it says this, it says everything in civil engineering in the whole country is under your autonomous control. And they send him into the country to be able to operate all civil engineering functions. It's very much the same idea, remember 9th Engineer Command? Very much the same idea that we had with General Newman in World War II, okay? Same idea, you got it, it's yours, figure it out. General Mays' assessment of Prime Beef and Red Horse, so when he gets over there, we've got about 4,000 engineers total in the country, 60 Prime Beef teams, 6 Red Horse squadrons. They're doing 1 million square foot of concrete ramp they're putting in. A big program was also hardened aircraft shelters that Red Horse was constructing, aircraft revetments that was the primary focus of Prime Beef at the beginning. So they've done all these good things. And what General Mays says is that when I arrived, the only way we were surviving was with Prime Beef teams, right? That's high praise, and talks to the efficiency and the effectiveness that we were able to do with Prime Beef. And then he turns right around and says, also, I believe Red Horse represents one of the greatest and most successful advances in the history of Air Force engineering, right? That's what we got in Vietnam in those two programs. And so the lessons learned out of Vietnam, there was 3 primary lessons that were learned out of Vietnam. One, we're back to the same idea of the Air Force needs its own engineers. And also, by the way, they need to be led by an airman, right? The same idea we saw in 9th Engineer Command in World War II, we're back to it kind of again in General Mays in Vietnam. I need one engineer that understands air power effects, that can responsible to the overall Air Force commander, that can do these things and get the job done. That's lesson 1. We also validate Prime Beef, right? We validate Prime Beef as an effective way to be able to go to war and to be able to respond to contingencies. And then finally, the last lesson, we have finally secured and validated our own organic troop construction capability for the first time since World War II. Since it left in 1947, we finally have our own organic troop construction capability, and it's back in the form of Red Horse. So we're riding high in Vietnam at the end of Vietnam from the engineer's perspective. So after the war in Vietnam, the United States experiences what we commonly do in a post-war period is we do a lot of budget cuts, right? We start drawing down the military. And so civil engineers dropped from about 100,000 people in 1968 to about 80,000 by 1972 comes around. So the other things that are going on right now is we go to an all-volunteer force, right? The draft is ended, so we're drawing down. During this time in the 70s, the Air Force civil engineer community repelled several attempts to have to shut down prime beef or Red Horse, right? These capabilities that we fought for, and we spent a lot of effort saying that this was not just because of the war in Vietnam. This was because this is who we are and this is what we need, right? So in 1978, General Gilbert actually gets this letter from OSD, and OSD says, hey, why don't you just get the Army to do it, right? The Army's still responsible for providing this to you, and they say they can do it, right? So why don't we just shutter prime beef and Red Horse, and then the Army can do it? And General Gilbert says, do you not remember the experience in Korea and Vietnam? They've said that before, and they weren't able to do it. So I'll tell you what, go get them to show you the positions, to show you the bodies, because what the Army does was they have positions on the books, but there's no bodies in them, right? And so OSD does some investigation, and they come back and they say, okay, fine, you're right, right? And so that's when we finally get the formal directive that, okay, Air Force, you can do heavy maintenance and light construction. That's where it comes from, is right there in the late 70s. So then President Reagan takes over in 1980, and his focus is returning to readiness, right? The Soviet threat is getting bigger, the Cold War is growing hotter. And so he starts infusing a lot of money into the services with the idea of we need to be ready to deploy at a moment's notice to go wherever we need to go and repel the Soviet threat. So in that environment, one of the things that the Air Force sponsors is this Salty Demo exercise. And it was conducted at Spangdahlem Air Base in Germany, intended to be an integrated airbase survivability demonstration. Basically, we had a lot of new concepts in the way that we repaired airfields, and the basic question was, can we do BRAT the way that we think we can? If the Soviets come in and crater our runways, are we able to repair them? And so the difference was in this exercise is that the level of realism that was in the exercise was unprecedented and different than the way we usually see, right? And this one, we actually tied the crater repairs on the runway to flying operations resuming. There was no simulations. So what we're typically familiar with is where you get in an exercise, crater repairs is not really the point of the exercise, right? The point is to get the pilots up in the air going and doing whatever it is they're going to do. And so we hand wave a lot of things that CE has to do. We simulate that we fast forward in time, the crater repair is already done, so you can go ahead and execute. That did not happen in Salty Demo. They actually built a second runway area, section of runway, actually cratered it with munitions rather than preparing it beforehand, and then said go. And then the pilots were not allowed to take off until CE fixed it. And Dr. Hartzer, when he was the CE historian, told this story from the wing commander that in the ops centers and the control centers of the squadron, the wing, it came to almost fistfights because the pilots were not used to that level of realism. What do you mean? I want to go take the fight back to the enemy. You can't. There's a smoking crater in the runway, and we're not done. That mentality was revolutionary, right? And in some ways, Salty Demo was a failure because what it highlighted was our inability to do BRAT the way we thought we could. But it was a success because it showed how important engineers were to the fight. By the time the exercise was over, we had about 30% of the base was casualties. There were fires still burning all over the place, munitions everywhere. We had difficulty even assessing what the damage was. But when I say it highlighted the importance of engineers, that same wing commander at Spangdahlem, by the time it was over, said, if I had only one more hardened aircraft shelter to give, I'll take the aircraft out and put the CE heavy repair teams in it. That's how important, and that's how much the operators understood what engineers bring to the fight, and that's what Salty Demo did for us. The big lesson out of Salty Demo, for the civil engineers anyway, and for the operational Air Force, was that all those recovery functions, one of the reasons why we couldn't put out the fires, we couldn't assess the damage, was that all those recovery functions aren't working for a single commander. And that was the big lesson that came out of it, is EOD has to go out first, right? But they're going to need some help from the heavy equipment operators to maybe clear the runway. And before they can even get there, they're going to have some support from the emergency management folks, which we called disaster prep at the time, to make sure it's clear to go. And then where the firefighters are going to be also putting out things, right? So all these things needed to orchestrate and run together, and so all those base recovery functions needed to be part of a single squadron. That was the major lesson learned that came out of Salty Demo. USAFE actually leads this, and in the late 80s, USAFE is the first to add EOD to CE. The other MAJCOMs follow, and by 1991, EOD and disaster prep, we called it at that time, but now we call it readiness emergency management. By 1991, both of those two functions had come under CE, so that you've got ops, firefighters, EOD, and emergency management. All those functions that you're going to need to be able to do base recovery all work for the CE commander now, right? Finally, that's that back 1950s. We said, hey, CE commander, you're responsible for BRAT. Now we've finally given him or her all the resources to be able to do that. Okay, so at the beginning of the 1990s, the Berlin Wall has come down, the Soviet Union collapses, and so we enter into this period again where, like we found after Vietnam, where the U.S. enters this post-war spending kind of era, right? Where the focus very much was on gaining efficiencies, reducing costs, draw down on the military. And so in December of 1990, the Office of the Secretary of Defense conducts several reviews into specifically Air Force, Army, and Navy CE organizations, right? How we do what we do, and looking for those efficiencies that they can identify. And in December 1990, they published the reports, or the results of that, in a report called Defense Management Report Decision 967, DMRD 967, and it was entitled Base Engineer Services. And so one of the things as the OSD investigators are going through, they found out was that at an Air Force base, the typical CE military manpower, the military manpower in CE typically accounted for like 50 to maybe 60% of the total military manpower on the base, right? In contrast, the Army and Navy was maybe like 2 to 5%, right? The reason why, that we all know this, the reason why is because the Army and Navy have civilianized out a lot of their garrison support, right? Because they use their bases differently. And so the investigators find this. In their DMRD, it's basically 3 recommendations that they come up with that could be summarized as, Air Force, we think you need to do it the Army way. The recommendations was, 1, we need to establish regional DoD-wide public works centers, right? Where this public works center is going to operate, going to do all the public works for all the DoD installations that fall within this region, right? Centralized under that one DPW. The second one was, Air Force, you need to cut your active duty military manpower by 28,000 engineers. Now at the time, what's telling about that, at the time was we only had 30,000 active duty engineers. And we had 20,000 in the total force, in the ARC, right? And so this is basically the DoD saying, you need to take your active duty capability and move it into the ARC, right? That's basically everybody you're going to move into the Guard and Reserve. And then the last objective or the last recommendation was a bit smaller one, was we think you can gain some efficiencies by updating your business processes, right? Some automated data processing, using more business-oriented management practices, whatever that means, okay? And so this was the recommendations that came out of the OSD report, DMRD 967. It is the DoD saying, Air Force, do it the Army way. And so as this report is being published, the Secretary of the Air Force at the time, Dr. Donald Rice, issues a very, very strongly worded rebuttal that says no. And the idea of his argument was, the basic premise, also 3 points, right, of his rebuttal was, look, the Air Force has different military engineering requirements than the other services. Why? Because I use my bases differently, right? Like we talked about way back when we talked about with General Arnold's quote, right? I fight for my bases. In contrast, the Army and Navy don't do that. They use them as staging areas to then go forward. So I have different military engineering requirements. I can't do it the way they do it. Second point was, I already don't have enough military engineers anyway, right? The current war plans call for 56,000 total force engineers. I only have 50, so I can't cut anybody. And the third argument is that consolidation does not give us the level of productivity and responsiveness that we need, right? I need decentralized execution, not centralized execution. And so he issues this rebuttal. At the same time he's issuing his rebuttal, the Director of Civil Engineers at the time is Major General Bud Ahern. Major General Bud Ahern is putting together this counter proposal. Now they submit to the OSD the same month actually that the formal report is submitted. We submit our counter proposal. The counter proposal is smaller reductions in military. This is where the zone maintenance concept comes out, for those of you that are familiar with that. Multi-skilling enlisted airmen, enlisted craftsmen, we do a lot of that stuff, and then we converted some of our unused military positions into civilians. So a much smaller scope. This is the counter proposal that goes back to OSD along with Dr. Rice's rebuttal, and OSD accepts that in 1990. And so the idea here, that the key takeaway and the significance of that is the level at which the rebuttal came from. This is the highest ranking airman in the Air Force saying, I value my engineers, I need my own engineers, do not take them away from me, and I'm not gonna do it the Army way because it doesn't work for the Air Force, right? So what I like to say is we're at the opposite end of the pendulum with the F-51 picture I showed earlier, right? Where the Air Force didn't value our engineers and didn't organize them and train them the way we needed to. This is on the opposite end of that. And it's coming from the highest ranking airman at the time, saying, no, I need my engineers and I value them and I'm gonna do it the Air Force way, not the Army way. All right, so it's at this point where I want to fast forward a little bit, and we're not going to go through every single thing that happened in the 90s. But one of the things that we did value, and we found out in the 90s and in the early 2000s, engineers were everywhere, right? We were in Panama, Haiti, Kuwait, Somalia, Bosnia, Iraq, Afghanistan, all the other stands, right? We were all over the place. A lot of things happened during this time, and the engineers were all part of it. But what we did during this time is we validated a lot of our previous decisions, right? In the way that we organized ourselves in Prime Beef and Red Horse, and in some cases, our previous decision to say no to DMRD 967. Because in doing those things, what we found is that when we look out across the services, because we kept capabilities that we had, that we were the only service that did. So there were several cases where when we were the only show in town, whenever the DOD needed something done, we were the only show in town, the only ones that they could go to get it done. And so I just want to point out a couple of examples of that, right? Everybody's got their own examples, their own stories that they know from this time, but there's a couple of examples I want to point out specifically. One is in Bosnia when supporting Operation Joint Endeavor. Operation Joint Endeavor at Tuzla Air Base, Bosnia, the Army finds itself literally stuck in the mud. They have to bed down 5,000 Army soldiers. They don't have the capability to be able to do base planning and just simple layouts and things like that. They don't have it because, again, remember, it exists in the Guard and Reserve. It takes a long time to call them up, mobilize the Guard and Reserve, and they don't have that capability, so they reach out for help. And the Air Force is the only ones that can do it. And so the 823rd Red Horse Squadron, under the command of Colonel Sue Waylett, the first female civil engineer officer, they roll in December of 1995 into Tuzla Air Base, and they start building out 3 tent cities for these 5,000 soldiers. And then augmented by, almost immediately after they roll in, a Prime Beef team from the 52nd CE Squadron at Spangdahlem rolls in to be able to operate and maintain the airbase. And so that combination of Red Horse and Prime Beef is able to bed down those Army soldiers, and in the case of the Prime Beef engineers, they kept that base operational during snowstorms that closed a lot of the airports surrounding it, right? And again, the idea was we were the only service that could do that. It existed nowhere else in the DoD, not with that kind of time, not on that kind of timeline. All right, so, and then the second example where something like that happens is in 2004, and it takes the form of what we called at that time in lieu of taskings, or ILO taskings, that later became JET taskings. But ILO taskings in 2004 during OAF and OIF, after major combat operations are over, the Army finds itself generally stationary, right? We're doing stability operations from a FOB, moving out, coming back to. And so the Army's not accustomed to stationary, right? They're accustomed to, like we've talked about before, fighting from the battlefields. And so when they found themselves stationary, they needed people that knew how to do base operating support, and they didn't have that capability within the Army. Okay, or they didn't have enough of it because they're also dealing with their own retention issues. So they reach out to the Air Force, and the Air Force accepts these ILO taskings in what kind of becomes this inverse SCARWAF arrangement, right? Now it's Air Force supporting Army rather than the other way around, like we saw in SCARWAF. At the peak of this, 50% of the CE taskings in the Air Force were ILO taskings. And the other interesting statistic is that 30% of the EOD forces in Afghanistan and Iraq were Air Force. So this was very much an all-in effort, right? It involved Prime Beef engineers, it involved Red Horse engineers. And it involved the civilians, right? So the only reason why we were able to do this, because again, in the way we've organized ourselves in our construct is, civilians that were back at home station, you're keeping the lights on. Sometimes without all the military engineers you needed, because we were supporting this. And the other thing, we also sent in, civilians forward, right? So AFC at the time was managing MILCONs in the contingency area. So we had some civilians going out doing construction management in Afghanistan and Iraq. So this was very much, everybody was in. Every Air Force engineer was in, and it's the only way we were able to support this. But eventually, it does become unsustainable. A couple of things happen where we sent engineers in. We sent them in. Army kind of talks in this lingo of, they talk bodies, right? They would come to us and say, I'm 400 soldiers short, so I need you to send me 400 airmen. And we did that for a while before we finally realized, well, maybe we need to talk about capabilities. What capability do you need me to provide rather than just continuing to send you bodies? Because then what that drove was a personnel dwell time that in some career fields in CE was less than 1-to-1 dwell, right? And we're just not being able to keep up with it. The other thing that would happen when we would do that, we send engineers all into Afghanistan and we lost visibility on what they were doing because they go in there for one job and then on this whatever FOB it is, they end up working for the Army 06 or commander of that FOB, and because we're good at what we do, when we finish whatever the original task is, they get diverted onto another one. They don't get sent home, they don't get sent to the next highest priority somewhere in the country, they get owned by that one FOB commander. And we just, in the meantime, we're just continuing to pump airmen engineers into the theater, right? That kind of comes to a head in the troop surge in 2007 where we realized we can't do this anymore. We're already at 1-to-1 dwell, we're breaking the career field, we can't do it anymore. We need to relook at the way that we organize ourselves in theater. All right, so something interesting happens when we start looking at the way we reorganize ourselves. So you remember the lessons from 9th Engineer Command, the lesson from General Mays in Vietnam. So what we look at, what we establish is that airmen should be led by airmen. Right? I need Air Force engineers led by an airman, and we had departed from that. And we had airmen being led by a soldier. And so we look back at, one of the things we looked at was the concept that we had in the 1st Expeditionary Red Horse Group. The 1st Expeditionary Red Horse Group was actually reactivated in October of 2001. It was we reactivated the 1st Civil Engineering Group that had been the group in charge of Red Horse in Vietnam. We reactivated the 1st Civil Engineering Group and then renamed it the 1st Expeditionary Red Horse Group in October of 2001. And the idea with the 1st ERG is that it was a theater asset, right? It didn't work for a wing commander. It did not work for the Army. It worked for the commander of the Air Force forces in that AOR, which at the time was the CENTAF commander, right? So this idea that existed, remember in 9th Engineer Command with General Newman, that he's able to see everything that's going on, know what the Air Force needs to do, and send engineers to do that, right? We had this concept in the ERG. So in 2007, when the troop surge in Afghanistan kicks off, we look at a similar arrangement for Prime Beef. And in September of 2009, we established the 577th Expeditionary Prime Beef Group. The idea was, again, it's led by a CEO6, and has visibility and command and control of all the Prime Beef engineer forces in Afghanistan to be able to prevent exactly what was happening before, where these people get locked into this one FOB and they don't get left, right? That one colonel worked for an airman and is able to say, you're done with this mission, I'm gonna hub and spoke the Prime Beef Group the same way I kind of do Red Horse, and I'm gonna take these people from here because I have a higher pressing need over at somewhere else in the country, and we diverted them across, right? That same idea that existed way back in World War II, we come back to it, right? And so then in March 2012, major combat operations draw down in in Iraq. And so what we do is in March 2012, we actually combine the 1st Expeditionary Red Horse Group, 577th Expeditionary Prime Beef Group, come together, and we form the 1st Expeditionary Civil Engineer Group in March of 2012. Still headquartered at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. Still the same idea is they are a theater asset controlled by the overall Air Force commander. So we're back to this idea that we had in World War II of one engineer command responsible to the overall Air Force commander that can orchestrate effects to be able to achieve the mission. Which basically brings us to where we are today, right? And what I asked you at the beginning of this lesson is, why do we exist and why do we look the way we do? And I think the simple short answer to that is on purpose, right? Because it is very easy when you come into the CE organization to believe it's just been a series of random events that have resulted in where we are today. But it has been deliberate decisions that we've made through time to make Air Force engineers led by an airman who understand air power effects and can support the projection of air power, right? Back to our purpose statement. And so Harry Truman once said, the only thing new in the world is the history you don't yet know. And the point of this is to make sure that you at least know our history, right? You know our history, you're proud of the heritage of where we came from. Because if history teaches us anything, it's that we go through cycles, right? Where the Air Force values us and then doesn't and whatever, right? We have cycles. And it ebbs and flows. But either way, no matter whether the Air Force realized it or not, engineers were still important to the fight. And I believe that we're returning to an era where that's becoming the case again. The focus is turning again, shifting to the engineers. And so what I want to read to you is, I'll leave you with these quotes. The first one from our first highest ranking airman. So the Honorable Stuart Symington, the first Secretary of the Air Force, in December of 1947, he said this: "With each passing day, it becomes more apparent that the nature of our air world of tomorrow depends to a larger degree on the skill, energy, and resourcefulness of the military engineer. Air power can never be greater than the construction power that backs it up." And then I want to bookend that idea with a quote from one of our more recent highest ranking airmen. So Secretary Heather Wilson, in September of 2018, addressing the AFA convention, said this:
"We have returned to an era of great power competition. We must prepare. A fist is nothing without the weight of the body behind it. It takes all of us to get that combat power ready and able to fight."
So that is, from the beginning and currently, high praise and high marks on the engineers. And so to paraphrase the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, General Goldfein, fights on, engineers, lead the way.